Thanks very much to the organising committee for inviting me. It's a huge pleasure to come back to Scotland and to Edinburgh, of course. Thanks to Lisa for the introduction. I was given the task of talking about One Health and also the Pandemic Institute that we've set up in Liverpool. But also this year I've had a significant birthday. And as happens, that's led me to reflect on my own past, my own record. And so I've tried to weave a thread of my work through some of this, as you will see. We're about to find out whether the thread unravels and things fall apart or whether it all holds together. We shall see. So I'm going to start with some of my own past. And this goes back to my first postdoc in 1989 to 1993, when Lisa mentioned that I was based at the University of Bristol, but I lived in Kenya. And I was, bottom right, I lived in this enormous wilderness of nothing, just bushes, 6,000 square kilometres. It was 1% of Kenya. And my time there, it was an incredible, what should have been an incredible sort of One Health experience, in that the place I lived was supposedly the largest cattle ranch in the whole of Africa, some 25,000 head of cattle. So it played a really big role in food production, food security in Kenya, and also driving the local economy and to some extent the national economy through the trade of these animals. The ranch had no shortage of zoonotic diseases. I myself worked on trypanosomiasis. Those of you who know Tsetse will recognise a biconical tsetse trap there. There are plenty of other zoonotic diseases that we were at risk of and occasionally got. The ranch was an extension of Savo Park, and it was full of wildlife, and there were endless wildlife interactions. The single biggest cause of mortality for the cattle on the ranch were lion, and they lost on average about one a night. And then we, as people living there, the few of us who were there, were also at risk of wildlife one way or another, with people dying or being attacked by buffaloes, lion, crocodiles, whatever. I will say, I think my penchant for wearing really short shorts acted as a sort of deterrent, and I came through it unscathed. The cattle needed looking after, so there were herdsmen brought in from all over Kenya, Maasais, Samburus, people from the far north. And they lived out in the bush under two sheets of metal. The metal was sort of old roofing metal, was held up like a triangle. And they lived under that during the day looking after the cattle, and then at night having the cattle in a sort of thorn bush boma. And they lived like that for 10 months of the year, and then would go back home for 2 months. The ranch was so barren and dry that there were no sort of peoples who lived there naturally other than along the river. And there was a very sort of not well known, even in Kenya, sort of ethnic group called the Waliyangulu who lived along the river. Those women are Waliyangulu. And they were hunter-gatherers, or had been hunter-gatherers in the past, including hunting elephants with poisoned arrows, and then following the dying elephants and getting the ivory and trading them with the Arabs down on the coast. So the people, the animals, wild animals, the livestock, we also all interacted incredibly with the climate and the environment. To be honest, I've never lived anywhere where the weather actually mattered anywhere near as much as it did there. And it really affected us in a way that doesn't happen in other parts, hasn't happened in other parts of my life. You know, when there were heavy rains, the first rain of the year, billions and billions of flying ants emerged, and because we were the only light source in 100 miles, literally covered us, and it was unbearable even as an entomologist. And also we couldn't drive. You know, when it rained a lot, we literally couldn't drive for days. And there was also a river, sometimes a raging river, that we had to cross to get in there. And again, if there'd been rain up river, then we got completely cut off. So really, this was a place where livestock, people, wildlife, and the environment were all interacting, and it was an incredible sort of One Health environment. But it's true to say that I couldn't have cared less about that. I gave it no thought whatsoever, because at that age, I was firstly entirely focused as a young academic trying to make it on my job, which was to study tsetse flies. I had no interest in any other part of the system, and I certainly wasn't going for the sort of the One Health aspect there. So I'll come back to that later, but let me talk a bit about the history of One Health, starting with three really important figures 100 to 200 years ago. You'll be familiar with a lot of this story, maybe all of it, but it does bear retelling, I think. Starting with Edward Jenner, because these are people, rather, who moved effortlessly between animal health and human health before the silos had really been built. So Edward Jenner, we all know, is the creator of vaccination. He was a doctor in Gloucestershire, where Gloucester cheese was being made. There were loads of dairy cattle. And he was aware, as a doctor, that people had been protected, or could be protected from smallpox, by sort of inoculating with lesions of people who'd survived smallpox, a process called variolation. But because of the cattle that were surrounding him in Gloucestershire, he also saw the protective effects of cowpox, and people such as milkmaids who were exposed to cowpox and then didn't get the deformities that came from smallpox. So he sort of put two and two together, decided to test cowpox inoculation as a protection for smallpox. So in 1796, he inoculated 8-year-old James Phipps with cowpox lesions, and 6 weeks later inoculated him with smallpox, and clearly James Phipps survived. And vaccination was created. One of the things I find really amazing about this is that just a few years later, children, orphans, were put on ships to go to the Americas and to the Far East as sort of incubating vessels to try to get the attenuated cowpox virus into those distant places by sequentially infecting the children on the boats. It's quite amazing. The second person is Robert Koch, German physician, who I think we can all agree was a high achiever, in that by the age of 40, he had firstly demonstrated the germ theory by inoculating mice with anthrax bacilli in his own kitchen. And he also, by the age of 40, discovered the bacteria that caused TB and cholera. But he went on, despite his medical background, he went on to work on a number of animal diseases, including rinderpest, Surra, which I think is Panosoma evansii in cattle, correct me if I'm wrong, East Coast fever, and various tick-borne diseases. So for him, as a great microbiologist, he saw no barrier between working with his medical background, to working on animal diseases. And then lastly, for this part, Louis Pasteur, who had, as we know, had demonstrated that microbes cause milk to sour, wine to turn to vinegar, and that could be prevented by heating to a certain temperature, and hence pasteurization. But he then started to take the vaccination discovered by or invented by Jenner and turn it into vaccines, starting with chicken cholera, or Pasteurella as we now know it, and then famously working with anthrax, and did a very public demonstration of the beneficial effects of vaccinating with attenuated anthrax at a meeting outside Paris, where he brought in front of everybody, animals that had been vaccinated, had been exposed to anthrax, only half of which had been vaccinated. And the control was obviously very sick. Oh dear. Sorry about that, that's me pushing too much. But because we know him as most famously for the work he did on rabies vaccine. And in 1884, he demonstrated that dogs could be protected from rabies by vaccination with an attenuated rabies strain. But the following year, he then had to, it was a French woman from Alsace brought her son into Paris, and the son had been bitten several times by a rabid dog. And long before Louis Pasteur was ready, he suddenly found himself, and somewhat under the radar, because he wasn't licensed to do this, attempting to vaccinate Joseph Meister, 9-year-old Joseph Meister, with rabies vaccine. So he did that in 1885, and Meister survived. And a very short time after, just the next year, hundreds of people were now being vaccinated with rabies. It's a really interesting follow-up to this story, which is that Pasteur's success gave him huge fame in France, and the Pasteur Institute was created. And Joseph Meister then spent his life working at the Pasteur Institute as a caretaker. But then in 1940, or 1939, World War II broke out. Pasteur was long dead. The story goes that as Germans entered Paris, Joseph Meister committed suicide because he didn't want to witness the desecration of Pasteur's legacy. Although a few years ago, some historians, science historians, changed that, or found the truth, or dispelled that myth rather. Equally tragic though, but it was that Meister believed that his own family had died fleeing Paris. He committed suicide, but in reality his family returned the next day. It's a very tragic end to that story. So those three men all played a fundamental role in the creation of sort of One Health, in the sense of moving seamlessly between animal health and human health without any barriers. The silos hadn't really been built. But the proper history of One Health as a name, really, goes back to Rudolf Virchow, who worked with Robert Koch, a German physician pathologist, who famously said, between animal and human health, there are no dividing lines, and he coined the term zoonosis. Subsequently, William Osler, who's one of the great fathers of medicine, working at McGill in Canada. He was a great advocate of comparative pathology, comparing animal disease and human disease, taking students out of the wards taking students into the wards to see actual patients, and a great promoter of One Health. Somewhat interestingly, I think, I read that in his later years, he became associated with the idea that people aged 68 should be forcibly euthanized because they were past their useful working time. I noticed, though, from the dates that he himself died at 70, so I think that's a little bit dodgy. But then Calvin Schwaber, who described as the father of veterinary epidemiology, who created the first department of vet epi in UC Davis, in 1964 wrote a book on veterinary medicine and human health. And he coined the term One Medicine, which then become replaced by One Health as a name. But interestingly, it's not until this century that the concept of One Health has really been picked up at an institutional level. In 2007, the AVMA, the American Veterinary Medical Association, and the AMA, the American Medical Association, forming a One Health liaison, passing a One Health resolution. And then in 2009, the One Health Commission was chartered. 2010, the big intergovernmental organizations representing food, animal health, and human health clubbed together to form the Tripartite Alliance for One Health. And then just 2 years ago, the UN Environmental Agency, UNEP, joined to make it a quadripartite alliance in creating OLEP, the One Health High-Level Expert Group. So that's a very brief history of One Health. In prep for this, I thought I'd better look up and see really when the term started being used in publications. So I did a search on PubMed, and this is what you see. And you can see very graphically that really it's a term that's really only been used this century. It started a little bit towards the end in the 1990s, but prior to that it really wasn't being used at all. And One Medicine, as an alternative, slightly earlier version, adds a few papers to this, but not very many. So it really is a modern name for probably an old concept. But I was really intrigued on the left that back in 1877 there was a paper with One Health in the name, so I thought I'd better investigate this. So this is a paper called One Health, One Disease in 1877. And I thought I just couldn't, by a certain Dr. Hayes, and so I thought I'd better actually look at this. It'd be amazing if it was a real One Health paper. So it turns out it's not. It turns out it's about how food gives rise to blood. Okay, fair enough. But then I then found the paper extremely entertaining, so I thought I'd share some of it with you. So basically, in this short paper, which you have to dig around quite a lot to find, he basically rules out eating a whole load of foodstuffs and gives the reasons why you mustn't eat them. So we're going to play a kind of game. And so first of all, we're not going to have to shout it out, but pork. you shouldn't eat pork. Why shouldn't you eat pork, would you think? I guess. Yeah, trichinella, tapeworms, fatty, indigestion. Okay, cured meats. So salty, carcinogenic, indigestion. Okay, raw vegetables. All sorts of things on raw vegetables could be indigestion, but it's okay. It's okay if you can eat pork, so that's all right. So, uncooked fruit. Now this is interesting because that is something that does give you indigestion if you eat too much, for sure. Indigestion? No. It causes neural disease if you eat too much raw fruit. Then we go full Victorian, and eating carbohydrates, constipation, eating cheese, constipation, unless you're a labourer working outside, then it's okay. And then spice. Now, interestingly, spice also gives you constipation, which I think is probably not to the experience of most of us in the room. And finally, we go full circle back to fried foods causing indigestion. So I guess, this is a bit of a joke, but it's interesting to see how much progress we've made. But the conclusion, the advice not to eat some of these things, we would say much the same today, just for different reasons. I did find that quite interesting. So One Health has a history, clearly, but what actually is it? We're all very familiar with this sort of triad of, what have we got, animal diseases, human diseases, and the environment, or animal health, human health, health of the environment, and then more complicated versions. But I think behind this sort of simple triad, there's a lot of complexity, and dare I say it, an awful lot of vagueness as to what we really are talking about. So, what's One Health for me? So this is a really good example, I'd like to think of One Health. Rift Valley fever, disease close to my heart, because as you know, I work on, amongst other things, vector-borne diseases in Africa. And with Rift Valley fever, we have this big environmental component where an El Nino in the Pacific, when its effects have made their way to Africa, in certain parts of Africa, you get a disruption to rainfall with drought followed by heavy rain. And that pattern gives rise to mosquito breeding sites, and a huge surge in mosquito numbers, and a rapid increase in the incidence of Rift Valley fever. And then following those El Niños, we can see huge numbers of livestock deaths. And then from the livestock being infected, we see human cases with potentially human deaths and certainly human sickness, and also very significant economic consequences, both local but also national. So a country like Somaliland, over half of its GDP is from shipping live animals to the Middle East. And when they get a whisper of Rift Valley fever, that just stops overnight, and the country goes almost immediately into its GDP being halved. But also that environmental component, it enables us to start to forecast Rift Valley fever outbreaks in advance of them happening, and then potentially vaccinate livestock before an outbreak takes off. So this looks like a really great system for One Health, linking together very nicely the environment, animal health, and human health. But what about these other ones? Something very familiar to researchers in Glasgow and Edinburgh and other places, rabies vaccination in dogs to protect people. But there's no environmental component to that, no obvious one, and it's very much an animal health and human health issue. And isn't that what we call veterinary public health? I mean, is this actual One Health? Probably, but don't know. Or the example on the right, which is something that I've used many times as an example of One Health, but now I question myself, which is the disease called Kuru, which was a disease essentially of cannibals in Papua New Guinea, where the people were dying from a neurological disease, and the medics who looked at this couldn't work out its etiology at all, and failed to find evidence that it was in any way an infectious disease. And it was a vet who told the medic that many aspects of this looked like this disease of sheep called scrapie. And the key to finding out whether it's infectious is to do these experiments for a very long time, because they've got a very scrapie had a very long incubation period. So Gajusek, the medic, went back to doing his work on chimpanzees, inoculating them, and this time left the animals for a long time until they did begin to succumb to a transmissible spongiform encephalopathy like Kuru, proving that it was an infectious disease or a transmissible disease after all. Interestingly, the medic got the Nobel Prize for that, and the vet just got forgotten, such is the way. So, are they One Health? Possibly, possibly not. So what really is and isn't One Health? I think we can all agree that going back to that triad, there's the human health, animal health, and environmental health part, and where they all overlap is really ripe territory for One Health, surely. But what about the bits where only two of them overlap? When it's just animal health and human health, and we're studying a zoonosis, is that One Health? Or is that veterinary public health or something else? And the same thing for the other overlaps there. In the build-up to this talk, I spent a bit of time trying to draw out a new diagram that conveyed what I thought One Health would be, with bits of this, a more complicated version, until I thought, I can't possibly show this, they'll think I'm absolutely mad. Because I just don't think it can be done. It's not absolutely clear, probably in any of our heads, exactly what One Health is, and we possibly all have slightly different interpretations of it. I would also throw in, what about other determinants of health? What about the health of our societies? Social determinants of health, which are really important, arguably a part of human health, but I think it's slightly different. And if we bring in that sort of approach to studying our health, does that contribute to One Health? So what do the experts say? What about the One Health high-level expert panel set up by the quadripartite? So I've put I don't want to read it out, but I put their definition on the right. But really what they make very clear is that One Health it's not a thing, it's not a subject, it's an approach, it's a way of working. And we've heard a bit of that already today. And it's systems-based. It's taking really complex problems with loads of interacting parts and using a sort of multidisciplinary approach or bringing different disciplines together to address this really complex systems-based problem. It's collaborative. I think you on your own, one person, me on my own, studying Rift Valley fever, I don't think I can say that that's One Health. That's me working on a zoonotic disease or a vector-borne disease. It's about the collaboration and that way of working that means you're now doing One Health work. And according to the OLEP group, this is also it's a very inclusive approach. And they bring in clean water, energy, clean air, safe food, climate change. I do fear that this last part really becomes a bit motherhood and apple pie, and it's become a definition designed, literally written by a committee to appeal to everybody. But nevertheless, I think the essence of One Health is there. So what about this idea of working together? How do we work together if we're going to be doing One Health? I've just mentioned the need for, it's a systems-based approach, so it needs systems thinking. Recognition of the setting of the problem and searching for solutions through all the different interactions that are there. It involves collaboration, but how do we collaborate? We come back to those three terms that we use a lot and often interchangeably and get a bit confused about: multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary, and transdisciplinary. So I put some definitions there on the right, and when I go back to so with multidisciplinary, that's let's say a number of people with certain disciplinary backgrounds working independently of each other, albeit on the same problem. So that's me back in Kenya. I was working as a team of three, as myself as an entomologist, there was an epidemiologist, and there was a cell biologist, all working on the same issue of trypanosomiasis, but I had actually no interest, or really very, very little interest, in what the other people were doing. And I think at that age, that level of that stage of my career, I really wasn't into the sort of multidisciplinary or approaches that are needed for One Health. So what about interdisciplinary? So that's where different disciplines begin to overlap and they work together on the same problem. Well, I think that's clearly a start towards sort of One Health work. But in particular, it's when we become transdisciplinary workers and we enter each other's territory. So rather than just approaching a problem with our own disciplinary backgrounds and trying to work together, we actually begin to enter each other's disciplinary backgrounds to get a really good understanding of it and approach the problem from the same conceptual framework. And I think that really is where One Health needs to be. But there's some risks here, because it's, as I said, we probably all have very slightly different interpretations of what is and isn't good One Health working. But there are some new kids on the block, which I think may take some of the shine off it. So one is planetary health. When you hear people talk about planetary health, it often sounds very like One Health. Health of the environment is bigged up. But within that, there's human health and there's animal health and there's a number of other sort of components to it. But really, planetary health at heart is very different in that it's asking the question, how much human activity can the world take before it effectively becomes uninhabitable for us? And it's about this concept of planetary boundaries, that there are certain limits of change. And there's maybe 8 different areas there. And it measures them in terms of we're in a safe zone, which is green, we're in an uncertain zone, which is yellow, or we're in a danger zone, which is red. And according to the work done there, the danger zones currently are in the loss of biodiversity and in biochemical flows, the use of nitrogen and phosphate. But the key thing here is just how specific it is. There's a clear problem to solve here. Can we stop ourselves exceeding these planetary boundaries? Another new kid on the block is global health security, which you hear a lot about nowadays. Again, bringing in zoonotic pathogens, antimicrobial resistance, climate change, and many other factors, but with a very specific question. How do we protect our health? How do we protect ourselves from these issues? And I think this is where One Health is at risk, because these new kids on the block have got very specific objectives and can be easily understood by policymakers. Whereas One Health, even though people use the term, as I said, we interpret it differently, and I think that's one of the risks for it. So my journey through One Health, well, you heard a bit of this earlier. After my time in Kenya, I went to the Pirbright Institute, and I began to work on midges as vectors of African horse sickness and then blue tongue. Well, these are not zoonotic diseases, so there's no human health component. But I very much began to work on the environment, and in particular looking at the potential role of climate change in the emergence and spread of these diseases, which is relatively prescient given it was the early 90s. From there, I moved to the Compton laboratory to work under our new Chief Scientific Advisor, Angela McLean, and alongside Roland Kao, who I'm sure you'll all know, on scrapie. Non-zoonotic, but we were also very interested in BSE as a zoonotic disease, and in fact BSE in sheep, the project was about. This is really my first proper delve into starting to work on zoonotic diseases. And then later I moved to the University of Liverpool, and I got a fellowship from the Lever Hume Trust, and I really expanded my interest and began to work much more on mosquito-borne diseases, zoonotic diseases like West Nile, Japanese encephalitis, and others. Working on liver fluke of humans and animals, and also diseases like plague in Madagascar. So it was only after I moved to Liverpool I really began to work on zoonotic diseases. But I guess I really entered the world of One Health during the GCRF times, when I managed to win a large project that I called Horn. Now I'm going to assume that all of you have played Wordle, and you'll know exactly what those countries are from their outlines, so I won't name them. But we worked in 4 countries in Northeast Africa, and this was funding training and funding research projects by local researchers, and trying to, with a One Health undercurrent, and trying to address SDGs. It ended a couple of years ago. We did many things in terms of the research done through the project. But as one minor example, we funded a lab in the building of a lab in southern Kenya on the border with Tanzania, right under Kilimanjaro. Really nice place. And this managed to get featured in a film by a French director. And as you can see there, there's some Maasais who are very bemused by this whole thing. But then you can see myself and Eric Fevre, who some of you will remember as a colleague in Edinburgh a few years ago. And then under the tree, we're also with Jakob Zinztag, one of the great figures of modern sort of One Health research. So that's really how I entered into sort of the One Health world. But where's it going? Well, I've mentioned what I consider to be at least one threat, which is quite hard to, still, even today, quite hard to define exactly what it is and what counts as One Health and what doesn't count as One Health. I think we need better examples of the added value of One Health working. Clear, documented examples to give to policymakers that said, if we hadn't done it this way, we wouldn't have known this. But because we brought these disciplines together, so we've achieved the following. Because there's still the feeling out there amongst some parts of the research community that One Health is a land grab by veterinary researchers, animal health researchers, to try to get their hands on the bigger pots of money that fund medical research. We've been hearing that for a long time, and it hasn't gone away. So there are still some threats there, but there's also some enormous opportunities. Clearly, where we are today, people recognise more than ever before, the importance of emerging diseases, and also that the majority have an animal origin. That's in part down to SARS-CoV-2, but also many other emerging diseases. There's AMR, there's the importance of food security, there's the role of animals in the effects of climate change on animal health and food production, but also the role of animals in climate change itself. But there's also this opportunity around the new ways that we can get data, big data, and in particular, perhaps, the big data that we can get through sequencing approaches, metagenomics and environmental genomics. And Ron Atlas has presented what he calls this new One Health paradigm, and we've seen this a bit during the pandemic, whereas previously, perhaps, we'd have seen a disease outbreak, gone in and investigated and treated the people or the animals. So now we can move to more environmental surveillance, surveying the environment and animals and potentially people with these large-scale surveillance systems, mass genomics, mass sequencing, and identify the existence of these threats before they've really materialized. Clearly, during COVID, there was a lot of work on wastewater detection of SARS-CoV-2. Subsequently, there's been that discovery of the polio virus in London. This is becoming the way things are going to work, and I think it blurs that boundary between the environment, animal health, and human health. And certainly for Atlas, it then leads to this One Health paradigm, where we do environmental surveillance, leading to prediction, and then potentially prevention. So, talking about big data, another way that I entered the sort of world of the linkage of animal health and human health relates to big data approaches. And about 15 years ago, I got funding to try to model the impacts of climate change on all important animal and human diseases. Well, we had a great resource for human diseases, which was the infamous, or famous rather, Taylor paper from Mark Woolhouse and other people in Edinburgh, providing that list of pathogens that were known to infect humans. But when we looked, there was no equivalent for animals. So we decided to set up our own, and we could have gone through textbooks and tried to get that sort of information out of the textbooks, but it would have been very static and almost certainly incomplete. So the computer scientist who was working for me proposed doing it a different way, which was to use text mining, data mining, and artificial intelligence approaches to extract the information from nucleotide sequences that were being uploaded and publications. So here we are a few years later, and we have a database built out of 180 million nucleotide sequences and over 8 million publications that have been screened, looking for evidence that a certain pathogen infects a certain host and that they're found in a certain place. And then we can build up our database from there. So we like to claim that we've got the world's largest resource of pathogens, their hosts, and their locations. So we play around with that, plotting out the network, how hosts are connected by the pathogens they share, for example. But more recently, we've moved on to other questions, such as looking for gaps in that network. What are we missing? What might we be missing? And this is an example where working with viruses of mammals, we have the known viruses of all the mammals that we know. And the person, Maya Wade, a computer scientist who's been leading this work recently, developed this technique where we combine host, virus, and network perspectives. So what does this mean? So if we take hosts, for example, suppose there's a sloth there. So there's 6 species of sloth. So suppose we know that a certain virus infects 5 of those species of sloth, and no one's ever looked at the 6th one. We might assign a high probability that the 6th one could be infected. Suppose equally we take a host, and we know that 9 out of 10 of a certain type of virus can infect that one species, but no one's looked at the 10th virus. Again, we might assign a high probability to it being able to infect. And then we've got the patterns in the network, the number of links to nodes and how hosts are connected directly or indirectly. The method that Maya uses combines these 3 perspectives, the host perspective, the virus perspective, and the network perspective, with a machine learning approach to assign probabilities that there is a link there is an association between a virus and a host. It's just no one's actually looked for it yet or found it yet. So doing that work, she found, because we would claim evidence through this approach for massive undersampling of existing virus-mammal associations. That shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but here, through this approach, we claim to have identified some 20,000 missing associations that probably that might exist out there, in that there are known viruses infecting known mammals, just no one's actually reported it yet. So really significant underreporting. As I said, that shouldn't really be a surprise. And then, as an example, we've applied this during the pandemic to COVID-19. This was a slightly different question. This was about identifying hosts that could be infected by 2 or more coronaviruses, because in those hosts where they might be simultaneously infected by 2 or more coronaviruses, so through recombination, novel coronaviruses might evolve, might emerge. So this work generated predictions of lots of mammals in which we might see novel coronaviruses emerging. I will say, that was a slightly different question. This work was done quite early on in the pandemic, and then subsequently a number of the hosts that were identified came to be found to be susceptible to SARS-CoV-2. It's a slightly different question, but nevertheless it reinforced in our minds that this was on the right track. And as it says here, at least a 30-fold, through this method, a 30-fold increase in the number of recombination hosts were predicted through this. And then again, we can build up that network from the observed network on the left of all the hosts that we know can be infected by known coronaviruses to what we think that network would look like if we filled in the gaps. So to finish, I'll finish with the Pandemic Institute. So back in 2020, I was on Twitter, surprisingly, and I saw a clip of Boris Johnson talking to the United Nations, in which he said something to the effect of, wouldn't it be great if we could stop pathogens, zoonotic pathogens, before they'd spilled over into the human population? Wouldn't it be great if we could find them in the animal host? And I thought to myself, well, that's exactly what we've been trying to do with coronaviruses, trying to predict the ones that we don't know about. And so I began to think about that, and in no short time, I came up with this concept for a new centre that we were going to have in Liverpool, a centre, and I called it all sorts of things: Centre for Pandemic Prediction, Centre for Pathogen Prediction, Centre for Prevention, whatever, preparedness. And the idea, in my mind, was that we would big up the prediction work, tenfold, and then go out into the field and start sampling these predictions and testing them, and hopefully identifying or finding some of these pathogens that are waiting to emerge, bring them back to a high containment lab, and start to produce new diagnostics and new vaccines. Well, 3 years on, I think it was a terrible idea, and I think we definitely shouldn't just be going out there sampling all the wildlife, because I can't think of a better way of causing the next pandemic. But the idea took hold. And my concept then got picked up by people much cleverer than myself and working on different areas. And a few months later, it came back to me as the Pandemic Institute with what we call an end-to-end approach, working from prediction right through to how we recover from a pandemic. So, have I got 2 minutes or 5 minutes?
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes.
Oh, perfect. So I'll tell you a bit about the Pandemic Institute then. So as it was conceived, we've got these 5 domains that we work in. PPPRR, I have to tell myself when I'm talking to the media. Predict, prepare, prevent, respond, and recover. And we claim to have been working in all of these in one way or another, and that we would bring in a whole series of other work packages or workflows under these domains. I'll go into them in a little bit more detail. But predict is some of the work that I've been talking about already in terms of predicting novel pathogens and so forth, and also the impacts of climate change on the emergence of diseases. Then under prepare, one of the aspects of prepare is that we would be working internationally, coordinating with partners overseas to improve surveillance and environmental surveillance for novel pathogens as they emerge. But also within that, there's the desire to have a sort of robotic, high containment laboratory so that we can begin to work on dangerous pathogens in a much safer way. And Liverpool's been leading the way in robotic laboratories. And also we've got this interest in infection, and it seems to be a sort of marriage made in heaven if we can bring it about. We work a lot on the diagnostics and developments of therapeutics and vaccines for priority pathogens. There's Emily Adams there, who some of you may know, who was at the Trop School and a great worker on diagnostics. We have a big program called Agile in Liverpool, retesting therapeutics as sort of reusing, finding new therapies from drugs already licensed. And then doing lots of work on vaccines. Liverpool responded to the pandemic in a way, very quickly, in an interesting way. We have an interesting link between academia and the city, sort of the civic side of Liverpool. And when, in late 2020, the government announced it wanted to test or trial mass testing of healthy people with lateral flow devices and see whether that could be used to identify asymptomatic people. So the announcement was made, and Liverpool very quickly pulled itself together to submit a bid. And within a week, we had the army in Liverpool coming in to manage that process. It was absolutely amazing. And many of us, including myself, queued for hours just for the pleasure of being tested and feeling that you were doing something useful. So under the Pandemic Institute, we have a program of work around Respond and how the city might respond better. But also, we've got additional funding now to set up a human challenge facility so that we can get in very quickly when there's an emerging disease and trial vaccines on people who are willing to take part in that sort of trial. As an important part of delivering the 100-day mission and getting these things out really quickly. One of the big hold-ups during SARS-CoV-2 and the pandemic was how long it took to get these experiments underway. And then finally, Liverpool also played a role in recovery. We were the first in the world in terms of the mass testing, but we were the first in the country in terms of trialling large-scale reopening through large-scale events. And sometime in 2021, we organised an enormous party of some 12,000 people and put together the contact tracing and the follow-up work in terms of treatments to see whether it could be done safely. And the evidence is that there was only a handful of cases, and actually no more from the people who attended that event than would have been the background. And that was one of the major steps in opening up the country, getting the economy working again, and in a much more place-based way, played a role in Liverpool subsequently becoming the host for Eurovision earlier this year. I'm going to finish there. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
So
Yeah, thank you very much. That was an amazing talk, covering quite a lot of ground. I think we have some time for questions with the roving mic. Does anyone want to kick off? Please, up the front.
Thank you very much. Excellent talk. Your point about your early career experience really rang true with me, that real focus as a postdoc on your single goal, your disciplinary core, and yet you've made the point about systems thinking requirements to solve big problems. Do you think academia is changing? Do you think the newer generation is being supported and encouraged to develop broader interests and true transdisciplinarity? Is the potential for building a career there? Or are we just going to repeat these same problems of waiting till you've sort of made it to some degree before you can be broader?
What a great question. I guess my feeling, and I guess I'm thinking about my own group and early career research and so on, is that we are in much the same place. Young scientists are entirely focused on having to get their next job, and they want to deliver on what they've been given to do, and don't really have that opportunity just to start to discover other areas. So I think probably it's a good question. I think you're right. There's a job to do there, and perhaps if we really want to get the benefits of One Health, we do need to make sure that our early career researchers are exposed to a much broader range of relevant science and become sort of multidisciplinarians or transdisciplinarians themselves. Very challenging to do that, given the pressures on them, I would say.
Sorry, may I ask, can you introduce yourself at the front? Yeah.
John Barasowski from SRUC in Inverness. Thank you. It was a very nice presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm wondering, One Health, it seems to me, is about research. And I'm wondering, you mentioned veterinary public health. That's a practice, not research. And are we yet at the point where we're doing One Health practice? Or are we still just doing research to create knowledge that we can use to do that? And what are the things that are holding us back from implementing that as practice?
Yeah, I think in this country, in the UK, I would say that we are, One Health is something that we do in our research, or we try to do in our research, if we can pull together that sort of transdisciplinary team or interdisciplinary team. I think in other parts of the world, there is more of a move to it being part of practice. As an example, I would say, in Kenya, there's the Zoonotic Disease Unit, which is a branch of government very much focused on addressing clearly zoonotic diseases, but having in place both sort of veterinary and medical expertise. So I think we're behind in that sense in terms of it being implemented as practice. And again, something that if we can persuade the policymakers that it's the right thing to do and they understand exactly what it is we want to achieve, then maybe we can bring that about.
There's a question over here.
Right.
Thanks very much for what was a very thought-provoking talk. And if I may, I've got two questions. And the first one is, does it follow that One Health is restricted to infectious disease or infections? And what about the other health issues? The second question is for your Pandemic Institute, which is an amazing concept. It could be hugely beneficial to the whole world. What sort of disciplines in terms of the people do you have in it?
Okay, so the first question is, I don't think One Health should be restricted to infectious disease, even though that's very much my particular background, I guess. So I think other areas where we need to bring together, multiple disciplines to work together, collaborate, and be transdisciplinary, even outside of infectious disease, be it in sort of, food production or issues around climate change, for example, bringing in those multiple disciplines. I think that's, whether that would be defined as One Health, I don't know, but I think it's very much using a sort of a One Health approach. So I'd certainly go beyond infectious disease. In terms of the Pandemic Institute, as I saw it initially, it was very focused on hard science and so forth. But as it is now, it very much covers both hard science, medicine, and social sciences. So you have big programs of work around how the people in the city responded to COVID, how we might structure society to better manage the next emerging disease. So we've got a whole range of expertises in the sort of the board of experts who oversee the whole institute. So it is, as it's set up, it's very multidisciplinary.
Last question. Introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Richard Reeve, University of Glasgow. Just following on from the first question about the extent to which early career researchers are perhaps doing One Health, are we actually setting them up to fail? That it's so hard to progress in academia anyway, and it's so hard to progress in One Health, that encouraging early career researchers to move into that area is going to make it even harder for them to move forward, and us old duffers can perhaps afford to move into the area with less risk.
Well, I don't know about setting up to fail. I think that I think I would say, and I would look back in my own career, I chopped and changed to an extent. I was an entomologist, and then suddenly I was working on scrapie. And I went with the flow as funding came and went and everything else. But I did that, and it benefited me. And in terms of the breadth of expertises and subjects that I got to work on. And I think maybe that is what we need to do. We very often look at someone's CV and we try to fit, a round peg into a round hole, and why wouldn't you? But actually, maybe there's times when we need to make sure that we appoint someone who's into something slightly different to expand their own skill sets. And I think that's the way we can broaden, certainly early career researchers' knowledge, and get them well set up into a world where hopefully, One Health will be bringing great benefits.
Thank you. I think I just want to thank you again for what was a really stimulating talk. I think these themes are going to carry out throughout the conference. And I think, particularly that last topic, I think what's an interesting reflection is that we set up One Health for collective action, and yet we set up academic systems where we have to work collectively to fail at an individual level. So I think there's like a paradigm shift within our academic institutes to try and succeed and fail as a team. So not everybody has to do everything, So I think there are things that perhaps we can pick up throughout the conference. Please join me again for thanking Professor Baylis for what was a fantastic talk.